The average person will breathe about 12 to 20 breaths a minute, or 30,000 breaths in a single day. So if I told you to hold your breath right now, how long do you think you could go between your next breath? If you want to try it right now, pause the video and go ahead. If you were able to hold your breath for about 40 seconds, well, congratulations, you are considered healthy. But just know 40 seconds is at the low end of what's considered healthy. So if you were able to go beyond that, then props to you, you're even more healthy. But if you were struggling getting there or you didn't even get to that 40-second mark, you probably want to work on it because something is wrong. Now, part of it could be that you're out of shape. If you're never going outside, you're never exercising, you're never even going on a walk or anything, then yeah, you're probably going to be out of shape and it's going to be hard for you to hold your breath. But if you were struggling even getting like more than 30 seconds, then there could be some other stuff going on as well. So I think everyone should practice holding their breath every single day. Now, why is this so important? Well, what are we doing when we're holding our breath? Our body is building up more CO2, or carbon dioxide. Now, a lot of us think that CO2 is a waste product because we breathe it out. We don't breathe it in. But CO2 is actually very important. It's actually what helps control our blood pH, or how acidic our blood is. Now, ideally, we need our blood to have a pH of about 7.35 to 7.45. If it goes too high or too low, that's really bad because our cells can die. And also CO2 is important because it helps deliver our oxygen to our cells. And this is called the Bohr effect. So whenever we take a breath, our air has about 21% oxygen in it. So as this oxygen enters our lungs, it attaches to something called hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is what helps carry our oxygen to our cells. So for example, let's say we have cells in our brain here. Our hemoglobin is going to take this oxygen and transport it, kind of like a train, to our cells. And once our oxygen gets here, it has to get dropped off and go to our cells. But the problem is, if our blood pH, or the acidity level of our blood, is off, then our oxygen is not able to detach from this hemoglobin, and it never goes to our cells. So this is why CO2 is so important, because this is what's going to determine if this oxygen is going to go to our cells or not. And when your CO2 levels are too low, you get a condition called hypocapnia. Now, when you get hypocapnia, it basically causes a bunch of constriction all throughout your body. So you're going to get basically vasoconstriction, where all your blood vessels are going to get constricted. You're going to get bronchoconstriction, where now your breathing tubes are going to get constricted. And you're also going to get a lot of smooth muscle spasms. So if you're ever working out in the gym and you feel a muscle spasm or something like that, that means that your CO2 levels are too low. And that usually happens because you're breathing too quickly. And when you breathe too quickly, you expel that CO2 way too fast. So basically, when the body is constricting everything, it's trying to retain as much carbon dioxide as possible. That's why it's constricting your breathing tubes, because it's trying to retain that CO2. It's trying to prevent you from breathing out as fast. And your body's hoping that by constricting your breathing tubes, it will slowly start to build that CO2 up. But the problem is, when you have low levels of CO2 and you have this hypocapnia, it doesn't just affect your breathing. It affects your entire body. It affects every single system in your body. And this can contribute to a lot of different health effects. And this is part of the reason why so many people have different chronic diseases. Now, also what can happen with hypocapnia is it can force a breath hold. Because let's say that constricting your breathing tubes is still not enough. Your CO2 levels are still too low. Well, the only other option is to force you to stop breathing so that you can build up that CO2. But now when you're holding your breath, it's not voluntary anymore. And this is part of the reason people get sleep apnea, because their breathing gets cut off when they're sleeping. Now, why do people's CO2 levels drop so low in the first place? Well, it has to do with the way that you breathe. If you're breathing too quickly, like I said, you're expelling more and more carbon dioxide. And actually, you have a trigger in your brainstem. And this trigger is going to be what detects your CO2 levels and triggers you to take the next breath. So our CO2 levels are measured in terms of pressure. So our ideal CO2 levels are about 40 millimeters of mercury. Now, at that level, ideally, we would take the next breath. And that's where our brainstem would kick in and tell us to take a next breath without us even knowing it. But what can happen is, if you start breathing quicker and quicker, your CO2 levels will start to drop. And your brainstem can kind of adapt, because your body has this neuroplasticity where it can kind of adapt to different situations, even if it's the wrong situation. So Even though ideally we want our CO2 to build up to 40, it can actually drop down to 35, or even lower, it can drop down to 30. And our brainstem will kick in and tell us to take the next breath when our CO2 levels are too low. And even though our CO2 levels haven't built up and got to the magic number yet, our brainstem is going to start to kick in lower and lower because our CO2 levels are always going to be too low. And this is the problem because people are chronically at this low level of CO2, and they're chronically at this hypocapnia condition where they're having all of these problems. So this is why I think it's important for you to practice holding your breath at home. Initially, you might think that if you're short of oxygen, you need to breathe more to get more oxygen. But really, most people are never short of oxygen because in the air around us, we have more than enough oxygen to saturate our hemoglobin. So the issue is not getting oxygen into our lungs. The issue is getting our oxygen to go from our lungs to go to our cells. And the way to do that is by increasing our CO2 levels. So by practicing holding your breath, you can slowly increase these CO2 levels and start to get actually more oxygen into your cells. So there's also a study that kind of further shows this. So they took these 3 different groups and all of them, they induced hypoxia. So they gave them low levels of oxygen. One of the groups was control. So they had no other manipulation with the air around them. And the other 2 groups, they actually added CO2 to the air as well. So one of the groups had 3% carbon dioxide added, and the other group had 5% CO2 added to their air. So what they did was they put them under hypoxia for about 5 minutes, and then they had to recover. And what they found is the group that was the control, their oxygen levels dropped super quickly, and they took a really long time to recover. But the groups that had CO2 added to the air, their oxygen levels didn't drop as far, and they also recovered a lot quicker. And actually the group that had 5% CO2 actually did the best. So even though there were conditions of hypoxia, the groups that had CO2 added to their air were able to retain more oxygen and even recover faster. So that just further shows how important CO2 is. So how can you practice holding your breath? Well, I want you to do this when you're relaxing. I don't want you to do this when you're exercising or going for a run or anything like that. And I want you to see how long you can hold your breath and kind of use it as a gauge. If you're only able to hold your breath for about 20 seconds or less, that's pretty bad. And that means that you could also have a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, and some other things going on that's also affecting your breathing. If you're in the 20-second to 40-second range, you're still considered unhealthy and you could still have a lot of the stress and anxiety, like I said before, you're just not doing as bad. Now, if you get 40 seconds or higher, you are considered healthy. Now, just because you're healthy, it doesn't mean that you're perfect. You can probably still improve this. I personally think if you get over a minute, then you're in pretty good shape. Now, you obviously don't want to force yourself to keep holding your breath too long. Your body does have this physiologic response in its body where if you are holding your breath too long, it will kind of force you to take your next breath, but you still want to be careful with this. But if you start to practice holding your breath every single day, you could start to improve your CO2 tolerance. Your body can start to naturally adapt to higher levels of CO2. And this is what can help change your breathing. And this is going to help slow your breathing down. Now, a lot of you might think that you're already breathing fine, but you got to understand that breathing is a behavior, and your breathing will change depending on what you're doing. Like I said, your body has this neuroplasticity, and it doesn't take long for something that is dysfunctional to become the new normal. Now, you might also be wondering, if I am breathing too fast, why? Why did that happen? Well, the answer is stress. Stress is the only thing that will affect our breathing. And that doesn't just mean emotional stress. There's a lot of different types of stress on our body. If we're exercising, that's a functional stress. We're physically exerting ourselves. And it also depends on what we're eating. If we're eating a lot of unhealthy processed foods, a lot of different fast foods, then the stress from those foods is going to also change our breathing. So a lot of people in the westernized culture specifically are breathing too quickly. And the reason is because a lot of people have this chronic stress. And what happens in turn? Their breathing gets quicker, their breathing gets more shallow, and now their CO2 levels will start to drop, and now their brainstem trigger starts to change, and it's a whole cascade, it's a whole domino effect that happens. Now, another way to improve your breathing is to use your nose to breathe instead of your mouth. And this is something that practicing a breath hold will help with as well. When you hold your breath and you build up more CO2, it's going to also dilate your nasal passages, and it's going to make it even easier to breathe through your nose. And when you're able to get into this habit of regularly breathing through your nose, this is also going to help slow down your breathing and also help control your CO2 levels and get you in that right balance of CO2 to oxygen. So some simple things you can try to start breathing through your nose is just using a medical grade tape and taping your mouth shut. And you can also try a nasal dilator strip. So these are basically pieces of tape that go over your nose, and they kind of help dilate your nasal passages a little bit to make it easier to start breathing through your nose. Eventually, if you keep this up, it'll become more and more of a habit, and that neuroplasticity in your body will start to change, and then you'll slowly start to get to the right breathing habits. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you liked that video, and if you haven't already, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel below. I will see you in the next video.